you so much for joining us today for our first event with Dr. Jordan Von Cannon, Did Susan B. Anthony Need a Pardon? Women's Suffrage, Personhood, and Race in the 19th Century. This event is the first of many that are in conjunction with the FGCU Bradshaw Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections 2020 through 2021 exhibition, Fight for the Ballot, 20th Century Voting Rights. A list of these events are featured on our homepage of the exhibition, so make sure you check them out. Here's a little bit about Dr. Oh, let me start that over again. Sorry.
It's a mouthful.
It is.
It's beautiful, though.
Thank you. I'll start from the very beginning to make it easier.
Okay.
Easy to cut it. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first event with Dr. Jordan Von Cannon. Did Susan B. Anthony Need a Pardon? Women's Suffrage, Personhood, and Race in the 19th Century. This event is the first of many that are in conjunction with the FGCU Bradshaw Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections 2020 through 2021 exhibition, Fight for the Ballot, 20th Century Voting Rights. A list of these events are featured on the homepage of the exhibition, so make sure you check them out. Here's a little bit about Dr. Von Cannon. Jordan Von Cannon is an assistant professor at in the Department of Language and Literature and co-coordinator for the Gender Studies minor at Florida Gulf Coast University. Her research includes early and 19th century American literature, gender and sexuality, and the digital humanities. Since 2007, she has served as the Vice President of Publications for the Society for the Study of American Women Writers. Without further ado, let's get started. So, what were some of those events leading up to Susan B. Anthony's arrest?
Well, thank you, Bailey, for the wonderful introduction and such a perfect first question as we get started. A lot of the events leading up to Susan B. Anthony's first arrest are very straightforward. Most people know that Susan B. Anthony, along with about a dozen other women, showed up in November 1872 in New York to cast their vote in that election. I think what's less known is sort of why that election, why then? And that gets back to a constitutional amendment that was passed just preceding the 1872 election. And so when Susan B. Anthony and these other women showed up to vote, they approached the workers at the polls and they said, "We're here to vote." And the state of New York said, "Well, you're a woman." And Anthony said, "That's okay. There is a new constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, that says that I am eligible to vote." And so sure enough, the workers at the polls, they looked for anything in the statutes of New York's voting rights that said specifically or explicitly that women were not eligible to vote. They couldn't find anything. And so Anthony and the other women were actually able to cast their votes that day. About a week later, Anthony was arrested. And when she was arrested with the charge of having essentially voted illegally, so having committed this sense of sort of voter fraud in that way. So a lot of the events that are kind of leading up to this first moment of Anthony voting is her voting with the intention of wanting to test the sort of legality of the 14th Amendment and the protections that come down with it in terms of who they will actually extend to.
Wow, so that's really interesting. So would it even be considered an official arrest?
It was definitely an official arrest. She was arrested. She was held in jail. She had to appear in court. She had to secure the essentially the rights of a defendant attorney because she couldn't herself speak in court. So it was official arrest in sort of all of those elements of the capacity. But it was an arrest that Anthony was anticipating. She knew that if she voted, even if they let her vote that day along with the other women, that most likely they were going to arrest her. And that was, I don't want to say it was part of the plan, but that was sort of always her intention from the beginning, was to kind of have this arrest so that these court proceedings would have to kind of bring to the light the public of what was really going on at this moment with women's suffrage.
So during women's suffrage at this point in time, it's considered first wave feminism. Do you think you could talk a little bit about what exactly is first wave feminism?
Yes, I love to talk about first wave feminism because it's coming out of the 19th century, which is my time period, and everyone loves second wave feminism. But first wave feminism is really unique in the way that it is a movement that begins, at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, but it really starts to gain traction in the United States around the 1840s, 1850s. And a lot of the sort of famous representatives that we have of the women's suffrage movement, people like Susan B. Anthony, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, people like Sojourner Truth. These are these women that are really focusing on suffrage as sort of one of many of the battles that they're waging. Women's suffrage as part of the first wave feminism movement is really about creating a distinct political and citizen identity for women, something that allows them to participate in the public body. And so it's not just about voting. It's voting because that, of course, is a very important way that we all participate in the body politic. But it's voting as well as custodial rights to their children. It's voting as well as being able to seek a divorce from an abusive partner or spouse or on the grounds of abandonment. It's voting being able to retain autonomy over their financial earnings and their financial wages. So it's suffrage that's coupled with a lot of these other really important issues for women at the time that give them in some ways a separate and sort of sanctified legal identity that is not connected with either their husband or their father. And so first wave feminism starts on this path of focusing on women's rights and on bringing women into a space of greater equality. But first wave feminism is really, really closely aligned and coupled with the other major political and social movement of the 19th century, which is, of course, the abolitionist movement, so the movement against slavery. And so for quite a while, these groups find themselves sort of closely aligned in their intentions of what they are working towards, which is greater equality and equity for both women and men of color and women of color who are being marginalized with the existing system.
Mhm. So as you mentioned, first wave feminism and suffrage, they were working with the abolitionists. But unfortunately, post-Civil War, they did go their separate ways due to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other famous suffragettes believing that Black men should not have received the right to vote before women. And then in this exhibition, we did make a point and we made a decision to focus on some of the lesser known suffragettes instead of focusing on the names that we most know or what everyone knows. Some of those women included Black suffragettes, Angelina Weld Grimke, Nannie Helen Burroughs, and Mary Church Terrell. So do you think you can discuss why the abolitionists and the suffragettes kind of went their separate ways?
Certainly. And that's one of the things that I think the Fight for the Ballot exhibit does so eloquently is representing the way in which you have this different group of people focusing on issues of voting rights with still having divisions within their ranks. And so for this, I'm going to share just a little bit of these two amendments, the 14th and 15th, that really brings about the fracturing of these two groups that are working alongside one another to begin with. So what we see initially is that we have this moment in which people like Frederick Douglass starts to essentially work with not only the abolitionist movement at the time, but also begins to focus on the way the abolitionist movement, and pardon me while I start screen share, but also the way the issue of abolition, so the issue of ending slavery, of introducing enslaved individuals and formerly enslaved individuals like himself into a space within the constitutional law where their rights as citizens are protected. Men like Frederick Douglass and a lot of the other leaders of the abolitionist movement, they see this issue of voting rights as sort of intimately acquainted with women's suffrage. So it's something that we have these problems that are affecting a number of different groups. Let's solve them all at once. And so for a long time, you have people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and like I said before, Truth and Douglas, all working alongside one another, coming out of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 up through the 1850s. And these movements continue to work alongside one another until we have the 14th Amendment that's passed in 1866. And so I share this amendment because I think this is one of those times where the language is so important. And because I'm an English professor, I'm always interested in the language. So I always want to know, what does it say? And I always think that it's sort of this surprising moment when we go back and we actually look at these amendments, that they don't say, all men or all white men. The 14th Amendment, when it's passed in 1866, following the end of the Civil War, says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And so the Fourth Amendment is really about providing sovereignty and protection for all people born in the United States. It was aimed at protecting the recently freed Black Americans in southern states to recognize them as citizens. But if you look at the language, it says all persons. So this is the amendment that when it was passed and ratified in 1868, Susan B. Anthony and the other women of women's suffrage looked at this amendment and they said, well, I'm a person. I was born here. I'm a citizen. I'm allowed to vote. And that's what the language of the law says. And so this becomes the amendment that encourages women like Anthony to sort of test the validity of it, to see how it will play out if they were to actually show up and vote at the polls. The 15th Amendment, which comes along shortly after, this is one of the amendments that I always sort of joke with my students, is the kind of the no really amendment. Because if you read the 15th Amendment, it's a clarification on the 14th Amendment, but I think that a lot of people could argue that we don't really need a clarification on the 14th Amendment, because if we're looking at the language, it says all persons. It's pretty clear, right? All persons. It's not making any kind of exceptions. But the 15th Amendment comes along because, of course, despite the language saying all persons, freed Black men were not being allowed to vote or participate in the body politic as citizens without having their rights oppressed or infringed upon. And so the 15th Amendment was essentially Congress saying, we were serious. When we said all persons, we really meant all persons. And so the 15th Amendment says the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any other state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so this becomes the amendment that really splinters and shatters the alliance that had been created between the first wave women's suffrage movement and what was the abolitionist movement. And it doesn't completely change the stakes for everyone, but it does change the stakes in a really significant way for a few. So when the 15th Amendment comes along, even though it is an amendment that again says the rights of citizens, it's not saying only Black men. The law nonetheless is being interpreted to say only Black men. And so for women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what becomes really tragic in this moment is that she can never really get past her own prejudice and her own sort of racism that comes out in this moment with this amendment, where she, in her perspective, sees the vote again being consolidated among men, women being separated out as not people. And for her in particular, for Stanton, it becomes this issue not of men like Frederick Douglass voting, but of men who perhaps don't have the same education level as her, or don't have the same access as her. And the thought that these Black men would get the right to vote before she does leads to her really vile racism that she can never get past in her life. And so she can't get over this fact that women are being put to the side. And so it's one of these things that when we see this happen, it's happening by design, right? Because of course we want to find a way, if you're in power, to kind of divide this abolition and suffrage movement, because if we can split this up, well, now we're dealing with two smaller groups rather than one larger united group. But it's really tragic and heartbreaking in a lot of ways when you see women like Stanton who cannot get past the racism that comes out with the 15th Amendment to be able to move forward. But it also speaks to the character of men like Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Anthony is able in a lot of ways to kind of move past the problems of the 15th Amendment. And Douglas continues to attend the National Women's Suffrage Association events until his death. So even though the 15th Amendment secures his rights to vote as a Black man, he does not give up the fight in pushing for women's rights to vote.
Wow. I mean, like you said, it's a very heartbreaking story. We really wanted to highlight that a lot of the minority groups needed those protections because, like you said, it's the no really kind of amendments. So, for example, the Indian Citizenship Act or the repeal of the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which we highlight, which gave those groups of people the right to vote. But kind of going back to how some people supported the 19th Amendment and even some feminists didn't. Catherine Beecher was actually one of those feminists who did not support the 19th Amendment. She just supported women getting education.
Mm-hmm.
And there were many other feminists during this time that did not support the right to vote. Same goes with the politicians as well.
Mm-hmm.
In the exhibition, we have a pamphlet that is included, which is in our collection. So if anybody wants to look at it, you are more than welcome to look at it. But anyways, this pamphlet is called Women's Cooperation Essential to Pure Politics, and it was written by Republican Senator George F. Hoare, and he was in support of the suffragettes. So could you maybe talk about how some politicians and some groups of people did support or didn't support the fight for the 19th Amendment?
Definitely. And thank you, Bailey, because it gives me an opportunity to put up the 19th Amendment so that we can kind of look at the language of that. When you think about, Republicans like Hoare, who's a Republican from Massachusetts, but is championing the right of women to vote, it's one of these interesting moments where you see the different ways that people are going about this same fight. Catherine Beecher is very much someone that we would look back and probably Catherine Beecher is a name that is familiar to some, but it's her more famous sister that we probably know more about, which is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who of course writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which really becomes this seminal novel in the 19th century that is credited with kind of bringing to the forefront the injustice of slavery among the sort of northern white readers in a way where they can no longer tolerate it and they must kind of take to action. It kind of removes any last vestige of this sort of passive indifference of, oh, it's just something that happens in the South, so I don't need to worry about it. And someone like Catherine Beecher, who's coming from a family that's really progressive in a lot of ways, but then is also still very conservative, and saying, women don't need the right to vote. They can affect change and manipulate their societies through their education, because essentially Catherine Beecher's message is, if we can't have a civic identity, at the end of the day, if women are the people bringing up the children, if we are bringing up this next generation of men and women, then we will bring up that next generation in a way where they accept the equality and the importance and value of all people. And so I love this time because I think it's one of those moments where we see in history a lot of people trying to go about solving the problem in different ways. And some people are choosing to work within the system, right? Some like Catherine Beecher, some people like Anthony, they want to challenge the system. Anthony, she knows that with the 14th Amendment that it's not being passed with people thinking of women as people, but she wants to hold her state and federal government accountable. And she says, if you only mean men, then you need to just say men in the Constitution. You can't say people. And then we have other women that take even more radical approaches to it. Susan B. Anthony voted in the 1872 election, but Victoria Woodhull actually runs for president in the 1872 election. And she names Frederick Douglass as her vice president nominee, although he never acknowledges the nomination. So you have a lot of women that are kind of seeking different ways to disrupt this balance of power. And so I think that when we think about the work that they're doing post-Civil War, in this period leading up to that kind of progressive era turn, which is something that the digital exhibit spends so much time focusing on, this progressive era for women. When we get to the 19th Amendment finally being ratified in the 1920, this is like what you said, Bailey, where you have people who are now celebrating the appearance of the 19th Amendment. We're so glad that we have it. And you have other people saying, we never needed it. We didn't need a 19th Amendment because the 14th Amendment says all persons. But I think when we look at this, what we see is that we did need the 19th Amendment because women still weren't being interpreted as having the right to vote. And so when the 19th Amendment comes on along, the language really parallels that of the 15th Amendment. Essentially, they just swap out race for sex. In order to make sure that it's very clear. And then this is the amendment that makes a difference in women actually being able to go cast their votes without fear of being arrested.
I have kind of a follow-up question to that. So as you mentioned earlier, after the 15th Amendment went through and was added to the Constitution, that there were laws put in place to try and block Black men from voting. Was there anything of the same manner for women after the 19th Amendment went through?
We didn't quite see, not for white women as much, right? Black women were still suffering and subject to the same kind of Jim Crow laws that were in place that were still attempting to disenfranchise Black men, predominantly in the South. We did not see necessarily the same kind of pushback for white women once the 19th Amendment was passed, but that does not mean that by the 1920s, everyone was great with women voting now. Of course, if you're familiar with the Iron Angels and the Iron Jaw Angels, you see the way that the women that were still working for the vote for the 19th Amendment were still suffering abuses. They were being spit on when they marched in Washington. They were being beat in the streets. So it's not this sense that in the 19th Amendment, we already sort of see this amendment being passed. It remains messy. It remains difficult. And there are women that are able to vote without fear, but there are still many women that cannot, right? Black women and women of color, especially Native American women, especially. So you have a lot of instances where we are still seeing groups being marginalized and oppressed, even though we now have this kind of clarification point, making clear what the intentions of the 14th Amendment actually are.
Thank you so much for answering that. So as you mentioned earlier with first wave feminism, how they focus solely on, the right to vote and household rights. Moving into when second wave feminism comes along, how is it different from first wave feminism, and what are the similarities or the overlaps between the two movements?
I think of second wave feminism it is like the wave of feminism that seems more fun for everyone. Like it's the one that people make the movies and the television shows about. No one wants to make the television show about the 19th century, but I'm used to that for the time period that I study. But, second wave feminism is really where we get a lot of those stereotypes about feminism and these other kinds of things that we see carrying over into our own day. But what's interesting about second wave feminism is, like I said before, it's really connected to women being seeking equal protection under the law, especially as it comes to the workplace. So looking for ways for women to kind of maintain work equality and these other protections. And it, again, couples with a movement that is leading the way for protection under the law for Black men and women. So you have second wave feminism and the civil rights movement happening at the same time, not by coincidence, but again, really by design, where you have these groups coming together and working towards a lot of the same goals. Like we saw with first wave feminism, again, we see a splintering, right? We see kind of a breakdown in different groups, and we see different versions of feminism that come out of this second wave movement. So you get people like, Gloria Steinem and others that are upholding, like Audre Lorde, this idea of intersectionality feminism that will really take hold today in what may be third wave or post wave, or however we sort of label ourselves now with the movement that we're in. But then you get people like Betty Friedan or other people that come up with sort of feminism that is really speaking more specifically to one type of women's experiences, right? What it might be like for white women, or what it might be like for middle class women, or what it might be like for upper class women. And so again, you have a lot of people that are working at it from a number of different sides, and sometimes their missions align and sometimes they remain in conflict. This is one of the reasons why I kind of included the Equal Rights Amendment there, just because it was passed in 1972. And I think sometimes we forget that we actually at one point in our country passed an ERA. We passed it in 1972. it was just never ratified. But again, the Equal Rights Amendment was one that was essentially another kind of clarification point to make sure that under the law, no rights should be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. And this is one that we still haven't passed, but nonetheless remains sort of at the center of second wave feminism, and also remains at the center of a lot of conversations I think that we have today.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you bring that up because during quarantine, I watched Mrs. America with Blanchett, who played Phyllis Schlaffer. I hope I said her name right, but
Schlafly, but it's the L, H's and L's.
But in that, it kind of showed a humanistic side to Phyllis, which was really interesting because, you know, she was very much against the Equal Rights Amendment, and she fought very much against that. So it's just really interesting to see the similarities between, you know, like I said earlier, Catherine Beecher, you know, and how they were kind of against that. And so, but I think that it is important too for people to know that, as you said, it was passed in 1972. It just has not been ratified yet.
Right. And I'm so glad that you brought up Mrs. America, because I think when people think about the Phyllis Schlafly, and you can go back and watch, you know, Phyllis Schlafly, they show up on a number of different like late night television shows at that time, each kind of defending their different points. And it's one of those moments where, you know, you think about like, why would a woman be against the Equal Rights Amendment, right? Why would this be the conflict? And of course, it's very strategic by design. You know, if you want someone to argue against an Equal Rights Amendment, rhetorically, it doesn't look very good for that person arguing against it to be a man. So of course, you need a woman that wants to argue against it. And I think one of the things that the Mrs. America approach does so well, the kind of age-old, you know, examples essentially, if we pass the Equal Rights Amendment, then that means that equal under the law no matter what. And so I always use this example for my students that, you know, when I turned 18 and I went and updated my driver's license and registered to vote, they did not give me paperwork to fill out in case there is a draft. But that is something that they gave my husband, right? And it is something that they'll give my boys, because under this country, when you're a man and you turn 18, you have to put in your information for the draft. And I think that most people would sit there, especially women, and say, oh, I don't necessarily want to sign up for a draft. And that's very true. But I think that the point of a lot of second wave feminists with the Equal Rights Amendment is, you know, if you don't want to sign up for the draft, the conversation isn't, well, then we don't want equal rights. The conversation is more, maybe we should be having a conversation about like, what does it mean that we have this policy for the draft that is applied to men in this country? And what does that actually look like? And so it's a different kind of conversation. And one of the things that the Mrs. America television show, and, you know, just for everyone watching, we're not being sponsored by Hulu or anything for this, but I think what they show is that, you know, there's a side to, there's some small part of Phyllis Schlafly's approach that she's imagining if the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, one very real threat for women in the workplace is that they end up having two full-time jobs. So it becomes an issue when women are fighting for equality in the workplace, where companies and employers can say, okay, you're equal now. So we didn't give your husband any kind of parental or paternity leave when he had a child. So now, even though you might be pregnant, we're not going to give you any kind of maternity leave because you're equal, you're the same. So it becomes this way that women could potentially be in some ways more disempowered or more exposed to different kinds of abuses, or have more sort of responsibility placed upon them, because now they're not only expected to perhaps take care of whatever domestic, either child care or elder care or other kinds of responsibilities in their home, but they're also expected to then perform in a workplace without any type of protections in place to account for what those responsibilities at home may be. And so I think that this is one of those kinds of questions where, again, it reminds us, you know, the conversation shouldn't be about whether or not we want an ERA, but the conversation should be about, you know, how are we holding employers accountable to make sure that, yes, not only does parental and elder care leave and these other accommodations exist for women, but that they also exist for men. And so it becomes a really interesting thing. And I appreciated that the Miss America show sort of looked at that side of it a little bit, because it reminds us just how complex and layered a lot of these issues and debates are.
Mhm. It's really important too to ask those questions, you know? So I'm glad that those questions are being asked. So my final question, I want to circle back to Susan B. Anthony because this is where we all started, right? Was with Susan B. Anthony going and voting. So did she really need a pardon?
No, Susan B. Anthony did not need a pardon, and I want to show you all why. So when Susan B. Anthony went to her trial, she was not allowed to speak herself at trial, but the argument that was presented by her lawyer really goes back to what I think is one of the sort of most tightly woven arguments you could ever come up with. And so when Susan B. Anthony goes to trial, and like I said at the beginning, she was anticipating this. She knew that at some point she was going to be arrested, and she wanted to have this play out in a court of law because she wanted the state and the federal government to say, if we only mean men, then say we only mean men and we're excluding it. So she comes up with this really brilliant argument, and this becomes published in the court transcripts. She writes essays and speeches about it. But essentially what she says is, at the end of the day, the 14th Amendment says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. And so Susan B. Anthony's argument and her defense is, either I'm a person and I'm a citizen, and I'm able to stand trial in a court of law because I'm a citizen that committed a crime. And if I am a citizen, then I didn't commit a crime because I am eligible to vote. Or I committed a crime because I'm technically not a citizen, because you're saying I'm not a person. And if I'm not a person, then I'm not subject to the laws of a country. And a not person can't be fined, and a not person can't be sent to jail. And so we can just all go home because I'm nothing. And I just think that that is just the most brilliant argument, because what do you say to that? If they say she's a person because they want to have her stand trial, well, then there's no crime. But if they want to argue that she's not a person, you can't put someone that's not a person and not a citizen on trial. And so I always love kind of her argument. And then I'll also share with you all just the kind of prosecutions argument, because when we talk about this and when I have these conversations with my students, I always have them kind of engage in this fun rhetorical exercise where we try to think through, like, what would be the prosecution's argument? Like, how would you argue against Anthony's defense? And then when I share with them how the prosecution actually argued against the defense, I'll give everyone just sort of a moment to kind of read it. But the prosecutor at Susan B. Anthony's trial says there, right there, beginning in the third line, the defendant, Miss Susan B. Anthony, lives in the city of Rochester, and on November 5th, 1872, she voted for a representative in the Congress of the United States. At that time, she was a woman. I suppose there will be no question about that. We think that there is no question about either the facts or the law, and that whatever Miss Anthony's intentions may have been, whether they were good or otherwise, she did not have a right to vote, and if she did vote without having a lawful right to vote, then there is no question but what she is guilty of violating a law of the United States. So I have a lot of questions. I don't quite know what the meaning is here. But again, this is an expected response, because how do you really effectively argue against Anthony's defense? You really can't.
Yeah, that was one thing that we really wanted to drive home in our exhibition, was that they're citizen, you know, people who allegedly don't have the right to vote, women, Native Americans, is that they are citizens and that they do deserve the right to vote. And so Susan B. Anthony is just such a wonderful, her argument and her act of defiance is really just a wonderful example and a shining example of what we were trying to convey.
Yeah, and Bailey, it's so beautifully put, and it's such an important aspect of the exhibit, because I think when we look at an example like Susan B. Anthony, it really recontextualizes what they were fighting for. it's not as if the language said all men or only white men are citizens of this country. The language said all persons. They weren't looking at a constitutional amendment saying, we know that it just says men, but could you consider maybe adding and women to your sentence as well? They were looking at something that said all persons. So when we think about their battle, they're not arguing for inclusion, they're arguing to be valued as people, as citizens. And that's a different kind of fight. You know, like you said, it's a different kind of stake. It's an argument about personhood and not saying, can we make this more inclusive? It's saying, can I count? Do I get to be a person in this country? And that's, I think, what Anthony is sort of such a testament to.
Mhm. Yeah, she's a really wonderful woman. Thank you so much for answering all of my questions. Those were all that I had, so I can go ahead and open it up to other people's questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan Von Cannon and Bailey, for the insightful interview. You offered a great deal of thought-provoking information, and most importantly, yet another reminder of how we should show our gratitude to the suffragettes and for all those who fought for suffrage by utilizing our right to vote. So vote, that's my soapbox for the day. Maybe. I sometimes can't help myself. And thank you to all the participants that are here this evening joining us. My name is Melissa Mines Vanderbilt, and I'm an Associate Director here at the Bradshaw Library and head of the University Archives and Special Collections. So I wanted to personally thank you all for being here. I have the privilege of leading the Q&A portion of the programming for this evening, so please continue to drop your questions and I will volley them toward the two, Bailey and Jordan. Two things to think about. So while you are adding questions, I do have two reminders. The link to the exhibit is being dropped in again. So those who haven't seen it can go explore. And secondly, if you are here for a class or if you are here for diversity and inclusion certificate, we're going to drop the link again to the Google Doc. You do need to fill it out to get credit for either. All right. Thank you, Kinsey, for dropping those in. And since I'm leading Q&A, I get to ask the first question. Dr. Von Cannon, can you talk to us about the incredible RBG and her historic argument on the basis of sex?
Yes, I know that when we had planned this session, we didn't know that we would be talking about it in sort of such a recent light of her passing. But I think that when we think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her work as a Supreme Court justice and the legacy of her work, more than anyone else, she is someone that shows us that these amendments, right, the no really amendments, have value and significance and are necessary. Because what we see happening is that it doesn't always matter what the language of the Constitution might say. What matters is how it's interpreted, right? How people read meaning into that language. And one person might read all persons and think, well, okay, that's all persons. And someone else might read all persons and think, yeah, of course, that's just white men. You know, who else would it be? And I think that she reminds us with her work and her legacy and her rulings and her dissents that we need these kinds of clarifications, that we can't assume that everyone is going to interpret something in the way that we would hope that they would interpret it, in the way that we would hope would be what we think is the most fair or just way of interpreting it. And so when we think about questions like the 15th Amendment or the 19th Amendment or the still unpassed ERA that may or may not one day be part of our Constitution, that these are necessary. These are critical amendments because we do need to spell out in the language sometimes something that tells people of our current moment and future generations, no, really, when we say all people, we mean all people. We don't mean people that just look like you. We mean people that don't look like you. We mean people who come from different places than you. We mean people who might have different notions about how they identify or how they describe and articulate their identity in society. And so I think that that is sort of her greatest lasting legacy, as a reminder that we can never really become complacent. We can never be complacent in our readings. We can never become complacent in our assumptions that everyone else is going to see the world the way that we do. And I think that that is what is so powerful about her work, because she had a way and sort of, you know, her famous kind of quote and ethos of leading by example, right? Fight for the things that matter in a way that other people will join you. And there's something that is so communal and is so valuing inclusivity in that, right? Making this something that we all fight for. And I think when we look back, especially on the way systems of power find new ways of narrowly interpreting laws or exceptions or loopholes in order to continue remaining in power, or in order to continue marginalizing or subjugating different groups. This is something where Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg would say, this is why what we do is important. We have to make sure that we're accounting for any way that this could be used to potentially to oppress or to marginalize. And we have to be more creative and more inventive than the people who might seek to make laws in a way that interprets and reflects their own prejudice. We have to anticipate those things and find a way of spelling them out in a way that it makes sure that it protects people and it protects everyone, right?
Equally.
Equally.
She did indeed lead by example, and she will be dearly missed.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question from Guy that says, you mentioned a group called the Iron Angels. Can you tell us more about them?
Sure. I mean, I feel like the pop culture references are so great, but there's a Hilary Swank film that goes into this. But one of the things that we see at this moment in the 20th century, as women are ramping up towards the real kind of battle for the 19th Amendment and for getting it ratified, is we have the Women's March in Washington. We have groups of suffragettes that are being led by women of color from Chicago and New York and all of these different groups from all over the country. And they're coming and they essentially are going to march for suffrage. And during this march, they seek the protection of the DC police because they're anticipating that there's going to be violence, and they don't receive any protection. And so these women are being accosted in the streets. And it's something that I think the film depicts very, very realistically. I'd say that it's very violent and it's very difficult to watch. What ends up happening is the women that are arrested during the march for, you know, daring to assemble in the streets in a peaceful protest, championing the right to vote. Many of them, when they are imprisoned, they begin hunger strikes or other forms of protesting. And so we have the forced feeding of these women. And so we see a lot of this kind of physical battering and violence that just reminds us that these amendments are not without cost. It's not just, you know, war of the words that's happening on paper or in the, you know, in the congressional and Senate floors. These are actual battles that are costing blood and sweat and other kinds of abuses and violences. And so there are a lot of really important moments to come out of that. Again, thinking back to the Fight for the Ballot exhibit, even at this moment where we have all of these women coming together, we still have groups of white women marching for the vote that don't want to march alongside women of color and saying, well, if you're going to march, you're going to march at the end of the parade, at the end of the line, which when you think about that. And we have dissenters, you know, Ida B. Wells, she stands in the crowd until the delegation from Chicago walks by and then she joins them. She refuses to march at the end of it. And so I think, again, that we see these ways that these are always campaigns that bring people together, but that they're not perfect, right? It's not this kind of utopic community where everyone suddenly gets on the same side of things and then works together for a common cause. But nonetheless, very rarely is it going to be perfect, right? Very rarely are you going to be able to get everyone together to wholly, completely agree to be able to work together. But that doesn't mean that the fight's not still worth it. Doesn't mean that you still don't try to find a way to keep working and to try and bring as many people as part of it. So that's why I would say, watch the movie and you can read more about it. But it is something that I think is really, it's difficult to think about. It's difficult to imagine, you know what I mean? That so recently, I mean, only a century ago, the idea that women are being beat in the streets of Washington, D.C. for daring to ask for the right to vote.
It's interesting too, because Wilson actually didn't put forward the amendment until the media broke the story about the forced feedings and the women on the hunger strike.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the same time, while people were willing to beat the women for daring to, march, they couldn't handle the idea of them starving or being force fed.
Mm-hmm.
I can't quite make that match in my brain. All right, thank you. So we have a question from Jesse, who asked, what can we take and learn from the past about the importance of intersectionality within movements? Great question.
Yeah, such a great question, Jesse. I mean, I think the greatest lesson of intersectionality, and it's one that I think in our current moment we really see in its strongest form, is that intersectionality makes for better movements, right? When your movement is inclusive, when you're thinking outside of yourself and you're imagining things from other people's perspective, it gives you a greater capacity for empathy and ability to work outside of your own interests. And so I think that when we think about a lot of these massive changes that we see, it's moments, right, in the 19th century with someone in the North saying, I'm not enslaved and none of my family are enslaved, but I still care about other people who are. And I care about it enough that I'll risk my life and my own family to be part of an underground railroad or a system that is protecting people. And so I think it's one of those really important, significant reminders that just because an issue doesn't affect us individually directly, just because it might not be a threat in our everyday life, doesn't mean that someone isn't suffering because of it, and doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to care and attempt to work to protect them, to make sure that everyone is safe. And this is one of the reasons why I think our own particular moment is so special in, whether we're in third wave feminism or if we're post-feminism, whatever people call it. But when I think about this generation of students that I see in my classes, I'm constantly struck by their ability to consolidate and take in widely disparate views from their own. So it is not a generation where I feel like, in my experience, it's this consciousness of trying to remind myself of, yes, I have to think outside myself. I have to think about things from other perspectives. I have to try to imagine things. Maybe it's social media. Maybe it's the connectedness of this generation, the way that they're so used to processing information at rapid speeds that my old brain just can't manage. But never do I encounter students who are essentially unable to say, I didn't know about that. Tell me more about that. Or, what do you mean your experience is different? I want to know more about that. I want to understand it from your side of things. And I think that that gives me so much hope and confidence, because they are able to have this massive capacity for empathy for others, and their ability to recognize without really a second thought that of course their experience is limited to just themselves. And of course other people in the world are experiencing things in ways that are radically disparate from their own life. And rather than that making them defensive, rather than making them retreat into themselves, they welcome that diversity and they say, tell me more about it. I want to understand what it was like for you. And I accept that your life or the way you identify or the way you live your life is different from mine, and that is okay. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of really interesting things as we look ahead for these different kinds of movements, because we're dealing with a different set of people, right? And different students and different generation in the way that they see the world. And while for my generation, I feel like intersectionality is something taught, it is a learned behavior. For them, it is innate. They live their life in a way that recognizes and understands that. And I think that that's so special. I think that that is so important.
It is indeed hopeful. So Kinsey asked the question, did feminists or women's rights advocates play a part in the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s?
You definitely have women as part of it. I know that when we think about sort of who gets remembered from the civil rights movement, it feels like a list of men's names. You know, it's Martin Luther King Jr., it's Malcolm X. And again, this is just part of the way history is sometimes recorded, right? We focus on the work that men are doing. But women are there, and women are very powerful, present in the work that they're doing. But, you know, like this question, we have to remember that women are fighting this battle on multiple fronts, especially Black women. So Black women are caught at the intersection of not only applying and fighting for the rights for civil liberties, but also fighting against the sexism, right? Also fighting against the sort of the ways that would construct them not only as less than, but as less than white women, right? As not even worthy of the same level of protection or the same level of decorum or the same level of, you know, moral outrage for their mistreatment when they're imprisoned. And so I think that this is one of the things that we see even today with the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of sister movement of it, Say Her Name. This is one of the kind of ongoing ways that when we think about how oppression works and how it shakes out, in the same way that in the 19th century, we have this sort of amendment that comes down that says, okay, we will expand our definition a bit, but it's still just men, right? It's still only men. And you feel women, once again, kind of pushed back for more men to move ahead. Women of color always get pushed further back, right? So they always come behind white women. And so when you think about the civil rights movement and second wave feminism, this is one of those spaces where, because you have women of color having to work this battle on two fronts, they're attempting to essentially embody this notion of intersectionality before we really have the vocabulary for it, right? Before people are really talking about it and recognizing what that means for them. And so I think that this is one thing that is really good to come out of second wave feminism and really good to come out of the civil rights movement and second wave work that happens alongside one another in the 1970s. Because what it helps to do, especially I think for white feminists, is it gets all white feminists to stop universalizing their experiences as women. Absolutely. You know, so it's not this sense of, well, I'm a woman, therefore I know what it's like to be a woman from everywhere, for everyone. And I think that it's a really hard transition, because for many of these women, they're operating from this place of, if I can universalize it, it's making me closer to these people and they're becoming my sisters and I can understand them. But for a woman of color, right? For a woman who is never just a woman, but is always a Black woman or a Latina woman, or, you know, like we were talking before with the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, a Chinese woman or a Native woman, that piece of their identity is incredibly critical to their experience as a woman. And so I think that when we think about this notion of sort of what role did the feminist or women's rights advocates play with the civil rights movement, I think what is sort of most productive that comes out of this is sort of what the feminists learned about this moment, right? What white women learned about allyship, what women of color learned about their own intersectionality and how they're being oppressed from different sides, and that it's not fruitful for them to try and excise or separate out and say, you know, okay, let's say, how do I feel oppressed as just a woman today versus how do I feel oppressed as just someone because of my race, and recognizing that you can't do that, right? And so I think that that is what becomes a real legacy from that period at the end of the 20th century.
Gloria Steinem is famous for talking about the fact that she, even though she became the face and kind of this icon of the feminist movement, one of the things I always thought was so powerful is whenever she was interviewed, she always listed Black women as her idols. She said, I always had to look at them and knew that they fundamentally knew more about the fight than I did. And, you know, not many people could say that. Shaylin asked, what could any of us do to make sure, this one's loading, Jordan. What could any of us do to make sure history starts to include women? Well, you could write it.
Yeah, I No, I echo that there. I think that the way you make sure history starts to include women is that you become part of the people that are generating the history. And I think this can look different in a lot of ways, right? It doesn't mean that history has to be modeled in the same way as it always was, but it can be little things. It can be recognizing that this sort of mythic narrative that sometimes I think comes with us from primary school up through secondary school that is hopefully kind of destabilized at the university level, but maybe not always. This notion of, well, the reason we only read men is because, women weren't writing, or women weren't there, or, women were busy in the home. It's just a lie. It's not true. There were women writing. They were there. They were participating. And it may be that there are scant records of their contributions that are being preserved, but nonetheless, they're there. So many of the women writers that I work on in the early American and 19th century American period, many of their writings were unearthed within the last 50 years. And so, I mean, this is one of those things where it's not this sense that we have these massive gaps in history where, well, we don't know what the women were thinking or doing or feeling at this point because they just, they weren't present. They weren't public in that way for us to be able to know. Their stories are there. Our job becomes figuring out ways to uncover them and expanding our definition of what historical narratives look like to account for different types of materials that might not fit our traditional definition of history, right? So when a scrapbook becomes representative of a woman's experience, when letters, when a diary, when a journal, when these kinds of private genres and these private documents that were never written for a public audience become ways that we get insight into women's experiences and the way that they were living. To speak about the archive and special collections at FGCU, they have a wonderful collection with the Minnie Gatewood diaries, which is this entire account and this collection of this 16-year-old girl who moved to Fort Myers and her experiences married to this minister. And so this is the place where we locate women's history. Don't let anybody pretend like it doesn't exist or like it's not there. It's there. They just didn't look hard enough, right? And so I think that we have to kind of hold those accountable and say, we can read this as history. We can read this and take value from it in some way that provides us insight into the experiences and lives of women whose worlds existed centuries away from our own.
That'd be a great class for us to co-teach. I want to thank Dr. Von Cannon and Bailey again for just a wonderful hour of so much information, and all the participants who came this evening. Check out the show. Check out all of our future events. It's all going to be worth it if we vote.
Yes.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.